Hi everybody and welcome. So today I'm going to talk about the subject of how to spot a potential dangerous relationship in the early stages. Really difficult because domestic abuse is confusing. It's designed to confuse, and perpetrators of abuse can be very manipulative, very clever. But I so often hear from women I support, I'm not going to risk another relationship again. I can't put myself through that. I can't let myself open to being abused so badly. I'll just stay on my own for the rest of my life. Now, I find that hard to hear because that just shows the ongoing impact of the damage that man has caused. There are so many common patterns with domestic abuse. Perpetrators so often show the same common typical character traits, and they go through one relationship to another, operating in the same manner. So it can be difficult, but then sometimes it's quite straightforward. There is much we can do to look out for these character traits of narcissistic abusers so we can protect ourselves, so we can see what looks like the early stages of abuse, and so we can back out fast. So today I'm going to talk about those red flags so you might be able to protect yourself from getting into another abusive relationship. So jealousy is very often it shows early in a relationship, and it can be very flattering, and quite a lot of these red flags of abusive behaviour can be quite flattering at first. So they might show signs of jealousy, but this will be wrapped up as showing signs of deep, passionate love, and it can feel quite seductive. It can draw women in. It can make us feel special, and so this is difficult. So you need to be really, really aware of this. He might want to take us everywhere. He might roll up in a workplace to deliver us lunch. He might want to spend all his time with us, and these character traits can be quite seductive, but as things progress, he might get edgy around us talking to other men in a social situation. He might get fussy about what we're wearing. He might suggest it's too revealing to go out in public. Other little things might creep in, but you've got to remember that perpetrators of abuse are very often jealous because they don't feel worthy enough inside. They feel the need to sexually control us, and so glimmers of jealousy are definite warning signals. Things always progress and get worse, but often jealousy can crop up quite early on, and it can seem quite seductive, but you need to be very aware that it can be a very dangerous quality. So abusive men are very often charming. There was a woman called Sandra Hawley who wrote a book called The Charm Syndrome, and she picked up on this characteristic of domestic abusers. They're often charming. They're often charming manipulators. Very often charm is a character trait. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that all charming men are domestic abusers, but you need to look out for that potential characteristic. It is a warning signal. Most of the women I support, they will say that their perpetrators are charming. They will say that they can manipulate anybody. It's a front, it's an act that they put on to mask their real selves underneath. So charm is definitely a warning signal. In isolation, it just might mean a nice man who's easy in company, but be a little bit cautious of easy charm. So showing off around others. So manipulative, abusive men are often big show-offs. The classic overt narcissist will want an audience of people to show off around. He wants to have the biggest car, the best job. He'll talk about qualities that he might not have. He might lie outrageously. He'll maybe want to be the centre of attention. And all this, again, so much of it is a mask, is to mask insecurities. Be very aware and wary of a man who wants to show off in public. They might have a completely different persona behind closed doors with you. They might not be that showy off person. They might be a completely different character, because they are showing two different characters. There's a public display, which is a mask, and then there is the real them, who is a bit more inadequate and inferior and doesn't actually feel good enough. So beware of the showman. Controlling behaviour is likely to show up earlier in the relationship. However, it will show up in a way that might look attractive, might appear caring, might appear quite seductive to women. We know that domestic abuse is all about power and control, and so the control is often seen quite early on. And as it's introduced early in the relationship, it might be introduced in a way that the man is expressing concern and care for the woman. It might be oh, you don't need to work anymore, I'll look after you, I've got plenty of money. It might be I'll drive you everywhere in my car, I don't want you to have to get on a bus. It might be oh, I'll take over paying all the bills and sorting out the money. Let me manage all of that. I don't want you to have to trouble yourself with it. They might decide what you should be wearing. And that might be phrased in I know what looks best on you. I'll pick the clothes that you look good in. You look so good. I can choose them. And this is all controlling behaviour that might seem seductive, it might seem to show care, and it might be quite appealing to women, but it's controlling all the same, and you should be cautious if this type of behaviour crops up early in a relationship. So love bombing is so commonly a feature of domestic abuse. Love bombing means a fast tracking of the relationship. Perpetrators of abuse will often have a huge intensity in the early stages of the relationship. They might talk about being soulmates, love forever, I can see my whole life with you, really early on. They might say, I love you, inappropriately early. And it can be overwhelming, it can be flattering, and women are sometimes very much caught up in it. There's often a reciprocation of this intensity of love, and women can often be drawn in to the relationship very quickly because of it. It is very often the tactic of the perpetrator, this fast tracking, this love bombing, the complete whole adulation thing. It's not the way that a normal healthy relationship will develop. So be very, very wary of being with somebody who wants to fast track the love, who wants to fast track the early stages of the relationship, declares love too early for comfort, declares offers a marriage proposal very early. It's often perpetrator behaviour, so be quite cautious of this and take your time. Don't feel forced into going with his time agenda. Take your time. Isolation is so often a factor of domestic abuse, and it often shows up very early in a relationship. Men might dress it up in flattering terms because they can't be offensive and abusive from the outset or the beginning of a relationship. So their isolation tactics might be around, oh, let's spend all weekend in bed together. We're so in love. We don't need anybody else. So cancel all those engagements that we had with family and friends. Just tell them they don't need to come round. We just need each other. And as time goes on, it can be a little bit more pervasive and manipulative. So be very, very cautious about any attempts to isolate you from family and friends. Understand that he will use seductive and manipulative tactics initially, but if there's any need in him to separate you from other engagements, to go out with friends on your own, to go and see family, to invite people round, then he might have intentions to isolate you, and it's a very big risk factor in domestically abusive relationships. So a lot of perfectly nice men might have had unhappy childhoods. They might have had poor parenting and been abused or had some sort of trauma as a child. And in isolation, that might be in isolation. What we know is that abusive men, domestic abusers, have very often had a difficult childhood, have a poor relationship with parents. It often encourages a lack of empathy, and for men to grow up feeling not good enough and go on to be perpetrators of domestic abuse. When I support women, so often I'll say, well, what was his childhood like? Almost invariably, like most times, it will either be, oh, he had a terrible time, he was brought up in care, or he really doesn't get on with his mother, she was manipulative and a bully and really cold. Or he might say, well, his father is just an unpleasant bully who used to hit him. He might not talk about it, just refuse to engage in it, and it might be, well, where are your parents? And he just refuses to talk about anything to do with his childhood. So as I say, in isolation and on its own, don't hold any of these things against anybody. However, often, so often, domestic abusers will have a bad childhood or some trauma in their childhood. And often, as the relationship progresses, if it does, they will use excuses about their childhood. Oh, I act like this sometimes because I had a really bad time in childhood. They might have had a bad time in childhood, but how are you responsible? How can you put that right? You can't. So be a little bit cautious about any disclosures about a bad childhood, trauma in childhood, estrangement from parents. It is a big risk factor. Blaming others for their own feelings and problems is very often a factor of an abusive man. They tend not to take personal responsibility. It can show up early in a relationship. They're often never wrong. Any mistake, anything that goes wrong, it's somebody else's fault. They might be blaming everybody at work for everything and never take ownership of their own actions. Really, really common. If they go on to be abusive to their intimate partner, it'll be, well, you triggered jealousy in me, you shouldn't have been talking to him and I wouldn't have snapped at you. It's not my fault, it's always somebody else's fault. And this can show up quite early on in a relationship, not taking ownership, of blaming other people because they feel inadequate and they can't cope with self-blame. Hypersensitivity to personal attack is a very common feature, and it can show up early on, as with quite a number of traits. So again, because they feel inadequate normally underneath a facade of confidence, they will generally be hypersensitive to anybody attacking them, and they will often perceive attack where there is no attack. And women will often tread on eggshells and be careful with their choice of words so as not to allow a man to feel that they're being attacked in any way. Confident men will accept that they've made a mistake. They'll be happy to apologise. They'll be fine if they screw up and get things wrong, and they'll just move on from that. Abusive men more often can't tolerate it, can't tolerate any criticism. They will sometimes seek out attack where there has been none. They often can't take a joke against themselves, but they'll dish it out to other people. Hypersensitive about personal attack, and they will often go into a rage where there was never any attack in the first place. It was just a comment made or a joke made at their expense in good nature. Often they just can't tolerate it. So the evil ex-girlfriend. What we tend to do in relationships in adult life when our adult personality is set is we tend to operate in largely the same manner. So we tend to operate in one relationship very much as we might in another. Obviously, the different dynamics and personalities of our partner might change our behaviour to some extent, but we tend to operate in largely the same manner, and it's no different to domestic abusers. So if they've been abusive, manipulative, intimidating, bullying in one relationship, they tend to be in the next. And so this might cause them trouble if we might run into their ex-girlfriend, if friends might say, oh, do you know he was really vile to his ex-girlfriend, or he ended up in court for assaulting his ex-girlfriend. So Perpetrators are often one step ahead and will possibly give us a story that she's generally an evil cow, that she was manipulative, that she did the dirty on him, that she had affairs, that she assaulted him, that she was controlling. And it is difficult not to believe this when we know nothing else. So there are often stories about evil ex-girlfriends, explanations as to why she might have reported him to the police. Explanations as to why a lot of people don't like him because of his treatment of an ex. Be very, very cautious and wary if you hear any stories about this. Abusive men have rarely got satisfied ex-girlfriends that they still maintain a relationship with. It's generally not the case. So what can you do if you have concerns that the man that you're with might be an abuser? Too early for you to properly know, but you have concerns or certain worrying patterns of behaviour happen. You could seek a disclosure through Clare's Law. Clare's Law means the Domestic Abuse Disclosure Scheme. So basically, if you have real concerns, you can go to the police. It's always discretionary what they disclose, but they might disclose any details that they hold, including intelligence reports, not necessarily just convictions, police records. Basically, they might disclose what they have. Now, it's a matter of for them to decide whether or not it's appropriate, and it has to be justified because it's potentially a breach of somebody's personal information. However, that can be really, really helpful if you've got concerns and you want to know what information the police might hold. And that might give you information with which to make a decision on how to proceed. Bear in mind that the majority of domestic abusers will not have a police record, and there might be no police intelligence either. So just because the police turn around to you and say there's nothing, that does not mean that he's not an abuser. That just means they haven't got any information that you can work with that will be helpful to you. So what do your friends think? So often it's the case that friends have reservations, but they might be too polite to say anything. They might think they're intruding. They might hint, but their hints aren't accepted. And friends often, well, they're not invested in the relationship, are they? They're more objective. They're on the outside looking in. And they might see the situation differently to you. If you want to know what your friends think, you might have to ask them overtly, because they will not want to offend you by volunteering some information that they didn't want you to hear. Very often it's the case that friends might have information that you don't have, that he's actually still sleeping with his ex-girlfriend. They might be in a quandary of what to do with this information. Very often it's the case they don't pass it on because they don't think it's appropriate. They think it would cause problems and trouble. Often friends really see an awful lot more than you do. Things might be said to them that aren't said to you because you're actually in that relationship. If you really want to know what your friends think, ask them quite openly. If you have doubts or uneasy feelings about your relationship, ask friends. If they're close friends, if they're friends you can trust, ask them. Gut instincts count with domestic abuse. So often we have a gut instinct and we can't necessarily think through. Bearing in mind, domestic abuse is confusing, it's manipulative, it's designed to manipulate and confuse. We might not in our heads be able to work out why we're feeling uneasy, but our guts might tell us that we're feeling uneasy, and we might have a sneaking suspicion, a concern, and we might feel it but not be able to completely put our finger on what's wrong. So I would say to anybody in the early stages of a relationship, gut instincts really do count. Trust your gut instincts and act on your gut instincts. And so many women override this. So many women will say to me, oh, do you know, I knew it was wrong. It didn't feel right. I couldn't understand why. Or they might say, oh, do you know, he was acting really abusively, but I just carried on anyway because I know sometimes he can be nice. But please, if your gut instinct is telling you that something's wrong, then it probably will be. Even if you can't work through why you're feeling a bit bad about things, if you are feeling uneasy and if you're picking it up in your body somewhere, my advice is back out. Trust your gut instincts. They're invariably right. So as we can see, there are so many warning signs that show up really early in a relationship. What is completely paradoxical is that a lot of these early warning signs are really seductive, are really flattering, really draw women in, and not only just draw them in a normal sense, but draw them in fast. We want to match the pace, the intensity, the love that this man is showing towards us, and it can draw women into really inappropriate, really dangerous relationships very quickly. So it's very, very important to look out for these red flags, to look out for these warning signs, to trust our gut instincts, to take it at our pace and not be dragged along by his frenetic pace. It's important to ask for Clare's Law if we think it's appropriate. It's important to talk to our friends and our family about what they know about him, what they think about him. Take your time, think, don't get drawn into it, don't be overwhelmed with it, and all the way, remember, if you see certain features that you're not comfortable with, that you don't like, back out fast. So much easier than when you're properly drawn into that relationship.